So this is a great time for me to start the meeting this way, but I'm going to shut my door because I can hear my husband giving the countdown to my kids that they need to listen. So just give me one moment.
The countdown is, as a parent, I know the countdown is some pretty serious business.
I could hear like 3. And I'm like, oh no, okay. So my apologies to our listeners currently and maybe in future, but I'm at home. So, okay, could you tell me how much time we have? I'm an academic, so I can go on forever.
I'd say like 25 to 30 minutes would be wonderful.
Okay, great.
Thanks for checking.
Right. Yeah, you bet. Okay, so let me pull up. Half my workstation is back on campus now, and so I'm making on a makeshift thing here. Okay, great. So I want to recognize my co-I on this project, Dr. Curtis Craig, and we're also working with Dr. Ron Van Houten of Western Michigan University, and he's really an expert in this field, has been doing this type of work since the 1980s, and so we're really lucky to work with him on this. So I'm going to give you a little bit of background on a project that we did previously in St. Paul, and that really kind of builds on the project that we're doing today, and maybe gives a little bit of insight into kind of maybe where St. Paul is, like why St. Paul is where it is and why Minneapolis is where it is. So the state came to us and said, you know, that pedestrian crashes were going up, and they were looking for some innovative solutions on what could be done to help address this. And one of the big questions was, you know, how effective is the Stop For Me program in St. Paul? So if you're not familiar with Stop For Me, this is high visibility enforcement by the police department working with the community to enforce the Minnesota crosswalk law. And so they knew that that was sort of an innovative thing that was going on and was garnering a lot of attention, but they really didn't know how much that changes driver culture to actually make people in more compliance with the Minnesota crosswalk law. So we took on that project. We went out in the fall of, I want to say this is 2018, but everything like pre-COVID is a blur. So I think this started in 2018, and we went out, we did about 1,500 crossings. So this was 16 crosswalks selected all over St. Paul. These are unsignalized marked crosswalks. And we do what's called staged crossings. So, you know, we work in pairs. One researcher approaches the crosswalk, plants himself into the crosswalk, and we give drivers enough time and distance that they can stop for us. And now the conflict is set. So we're in the crosswalk. They have more than enough time to stop for us. If they don't stop for us, they're now in violation of the law. If they don't stop for us, then we're making tallies on a sheet to show not yield, not yield, not yield. And then when they do yield, we mark what distance. So we have some marks in the roadway because we want drivers stopping further back from the crosswalk. That makes things safer for the pedestrian. So the good news when we went out was we found when drivers were stopping, a good deal of them were stopping greater than 40 feet back. So that was really good. And only a small percentage, about 3.5%, were stopping less than 10 feet. You definitely don't want to stop less than 10 feet from a crosswalk. That puts the pedestrian in a lot of danger. But only about 34% of drivers were stopping for us, averaged across the 16 sites. The most concerning data point that we found was 11% of every crossing that we attempted, we observed what we call a multiple threat pass. So multiple threat pass is when one vehicle stops for the pedestrian, and in the next lane of travel, a vehicle goes on through. or often what happens in many St. Paul roadways where the lanes are really wide, they'll pass on the right. So in the parking lane, or the lane is really wide, so they'll pass on the right. And in more extreme versions back then, I hate to say it, but this is not uncommon today, but back then this was a rare thing to see. Someone would cross the center line and go in the opposing lane of traffic to pass the vehicles. That's extremely dangerous for the pedestrian, obviously, because your head is looking the opposite direction, looking for vehicles. You're not expecting traffic to be going in the opposite direction of travel in the lane. And we would see that on occasion. There's one section we were at Cretin Avenue where it's pretty narrow and you couldn't pass on the right. So they would cross the center line to pass on the left. Now, under the law, these two violations are the same. So if you don't yield for a pedestrian in a crosswalk, you violated the Minnesota crosswalk law. If a vehicle has stopped for the pedestrian and you violate and go through the crosswalk, it's the same violation, so that there's no difference to the penalty to the driver if you're caught doing that. But the risk to the driver or risk to the pedestrian is really high, often because by the time the vehicle strikes the pedestrian, it's usually closer to at full speed. As we know, the closer you are going to about 40 miles an hour, the more likely that pedestrian is going to be killed in that strike. So we knew that we really needed to focus on multiple threat passes. How can we really address that? We looked into changing the fee, but that's set by the Minnesota statewide payable list. We couldn't do that. And so what the police could do was check a box on the ticket called endangering life or public property. And so if that gets checked on your ticket, you can't pay the fine. You have to appear before a judge. And so the idea was we could change that as policy, that anytime a driver was observed doing a multiple threat pass, then the box would be checked and they would have to see a judge rather than just paying the penalty. And that allowed us to get a lot of visibility and leverage with the media, because it was sort of introducing something new and helped draw more attention to the study. So Ron knew that in past work, you really need to announce loud and clear when and where you're going to be doing high visibility enforcement, starting with a warning wave only. And so no one's getting a ticket in that first wave. You want to give as much opportunity as possible. So everybody's kind of getting with the program, and you re-announce and really capitalize on those community partners. We sent out flyers like this. If you think these sketches are bad, don't mention it because I drew them myself, but we didn't have budget for an artist. So I sketched these out, but really trying to convey to people sort of the dangers of multiple threat and why you really need to stop further back. And so we shared these with community groups. We shared these with St. Paul Public Schools. Oh, well, thank you very much. I appreciate the nod. My art teacher would be proud that since I went into science and not art. So these were the types of things that we were really leveraging to, really leveraging to try to push the message along with this planned enforcement. And so in the first wave was this enforcement wave, but it was only warning. So at that point, they were enforcing half of our crosswalks, issued over a little over 1,000 warnings. The second wave, then they started issuing tickets. So far fewer tickets were being issued than warnings, a few warnings still being issued, but it's a lot slower to churn through. And so they had to let a lot of cars go on through just because you can't process enough. And then the social feedback signs began. So these these may be familiar to you that you're seeing in Minneapolis currently, and we have these up again in St. Paul. But these are social norming signs to sort of say, like, most drivers do a thing and you should want to be like most drivers. It's also implied surveillance, meaning somebody's watching you, and people start to wonder, like, how did they get these numbers and who's watching me? The challenge when this program rolled out, and this is a big challenge that we have today, is social norming doesn't work so well if most drivers are doing the bad thing. And so what was happening when these signs rolled out was only 40% or 43% of drivers the previous week had stopped for us. So the majority was doing the wrong thing. I started getting like emails from pompous graduate students telling me I don't understand the principle. And so all those really great things, along with all other types of hate mail about the project. But I heard from lots of people about this. And we weren't worried because we knew new treatments were coming. We knew the numbers were going to climb as this program was building. So the next waves were these in-street signs. Now you may be seeing some of these popping up. I mean, these are always out, but these are popping up in Minneapolis and St. Paul right now for our current study. But these are in-street signs, right? Yeah. And so the third wave, we did a single in-street sign. The fourth wave, we did what's called a gateway treatment. So this is where you put multiple of these signs up. Cities don't like to do this, of course, because it's just more signs that get battered. And it's really hard to get engineers and public works departments to get excited about this design, but it's really effective, like highly, highly effective, because it's a traffic calming measure in addition to raising visibility to pedestrian safety in the crosswalk. So it reminds people that the law is the law, that sort of impinges on them as they drive through these signs. It's really, really effective. And so these are all sort of being layered in this very sort of planned program that we did. So this shows you what the numbers look like. So we had a fair amount of noise early on as we were sort of building this study. But the gray line shows the sites that were receiving no treatment. So we didn't have any enforcement and no engineering treatment. And then we had, these are the treatment sites, so the red. So that's had police enforcement and this engineering treatment. And little by little, it all started to build and really had this groundswell around wave 3, which is when the in-street signs went in. And there was a lot of buzz on Twitter about the blue signs, and more people started talking about it. And the signs really started to become this feedback mechanism that, like, the numbers would pop up a little bit and then people would be talking a little bit more about it. And then that would make the numbers go up more. And at some point when the numbers started to push above 70, it switched from, like, you know, the strip saying that I'm trying to shame drivers to now, like, people are saying, like, she's lying and these numbers aren't real and these are fake, right? So, like, you can't please everybody, but it really did start to drive up. And what was really cool was these sites where, you know, we hadn't been treating, they started getting 60% yielding. Like, nothing had changed at those sites, but really started to show that there was this sort of, like, generalization. The whole culture of St. Paul started to shift with this program. The big thing was these multiple threat passes. So, you know, especially at the beginning, man, we were seeing tons of multiple threat passes. They were higher at the treatment sites because just by chance alone, those had more lanes than the untreated sites. So we started really high. And then by the end of the study, it was really rare. We almost never saw a multiple threat pass. And that was really exciting because those are just, quite frankly, really scary and dangerous for my team and for the public. And so we really want to make those really rare. So this new study that we were proposing was, can we expand this program to signalized intersections? We know that many pedestrians tend to be killed if they're killed in a crosswalk. It's often a signalized intersection and not an unsignalized intersection. And often that's because of turning vehicles. And then also we had this big question of, in that fourth wave where things, or excuse me, the third wave, when the numbers really jumped, the question was it the police? Was it the in-street signs? Was it super additives, some sort of special combination of those? Was there a time factor? Like, we couldn't tell because that wasn't the intent of the study. The intent of the study was to test the program, which is what we did. But it still left us with a lot of looming questions. And you know, in a very timely manner, because all of this research was pitched before the killing of George Floyd. And so, you know, as the contract started to launch, it became a really pressing question, which is, what is the role of enforcement in traffic safety? How critical is enforcement in achieving traffic safety goals? And can we achieve these types of program improvements without enforcement being a component of the study. Now, I'll be honest, the original study design was supposed to include, and St. Paul was going to have engineering and enforcement. In Minneapolis, we were going to have engineering only. And so we were really going to be trying to test the strength of how much does enforcement add to the program versus trying the program without enforcement. But between the research being pitched and going live with the killing of George Floyd, and then before we went to go collect data at Dante Wright, right? So like all this is happening in real time and in a time that was really challenging for me as a researcher, for the state as they're funding this research. And so in the end, they said, we're pulling enforcement out altogether, and we want you to focus on engineering only in both cities to see, can it work in both cities doing engineering only? Now, the challenge with that is that I can't undo the fact that the Stop For Me program had been running for 7 years in St. Paul. And there was a history of enforcement reinforcing the Minnesota crosswalk law in St. Paul in a way that had not been happening in Minneapolis. And this is really just the challenge of doing research in the real world. Outside of my laboratory, I can't control all of these things. So we really wanted to look at expanding the program to signalized and unsignalized intersections, with a big focus on turning vehicles at those signalized intersections. We really wanted to look at education outreach, engineering enhancements at our sites, and then also look at some of these, what we call time distance halo effects, where if we're treating two intersections that are sort of clustered together, can we build upon that? So we have one intersection that's near another intersection, they're both being treated, and that sort of reprimes the driver. I go through this intersection, then I go through another one, and they're both sort of treated with engineering treatments. Can that help build the program? So this sort of just gets to the study design. We had signalized and unsignalized treatment, no treatment. So half of the sites are getting treatment, half are not. These were the planned phases originally. Everything sort of got shifted back with a lot of COVID delays and pushing out these different things. So wave 4 starts next week. So this gives you a sense of the sites that were originally slated. So we were going to have engineering and enforcement. In the end, we ended up having to make some changes and have the engineering enforcement sites become engineering only sites. So for example, here we have Cleveland and Pinehurst and Ford Parkway and Cleveland Avenue that doesn't have any enforcement. That's just only engineering. You can see that these are the clusters that we have in St. Paul. So a good, nice stretch of the city. So my coders are out at these intersections twice a week. And so we're out there. And then this is the Minneapolis. So these are two things. The Minneapolis map doesn't fit on a PowerPoint slide as well as the St. Paul map does. But this shows you the breakdown of the sites that we've selected. So we worked with the city and they prioritized which intersections they wanted us to focus on. And so if you have questions about exactly why we chose these intersections, I can't give you too much more information other than we had made some recommendations, and ultimately this is the list that they gave us to work with. So if it's in blue, it's been receiving engineering treatment, and if it's in gray, it has not been receiving any treatment. So that's a generalization site. So again, we don't call it a control site because we are looking for change, right? A control site you're assuming won't change, but we are hoping that all of these sites improve. It's just through spillover effects of the community sort of starting to shift and change. The other thing that we've been working on is the Twin Cities Safety Pledge. And so we've been, perhaps you've seen this distributed through the neighborhood groups already. If not, I will reshare it with you and we can push this out once again. So in the absence of the enforcement treatment, we were really looking for other ways that we can enhance and really reinforce the idea that this is an issue and get people really committed. And this sort of taps into something that's called a theory of planned behavior, which is if people make a plan to act in a certain way, they're more likely to do that behavior later. And so we really want people to make a plan to sort of follow these basic steps here. So we had, 5 basic things for drivers, for pedestrians, and for bicyclists. And we tried to be really mindful of thinking of exactly the wording and phrasing, and I'm not a big advocate of like safety is a shared responsibility when we're talking about drivers and pedestrians, because there isn't a shared power balance of those road users. But really a lot of what we were trying to encourage here for pedestrians is not so much, we do want them to cross at crosswalks, and we do want them to obey traffic signals as they're crossing at signalized intersections. Largely, we just don't want them to trust drivers, and we don't want them to assume that drivers will stop for them when they step out into the roadway. So I think that that's really important, of learning to be predictable and slightly untrusting of drivers. Okay, any questions about the pledge? Okay, so that's really the study design. Now, where are we today? Well, things aren't going so well for the numbers in Minneapolis, and so we're sort of plagued by a number of things. One, driving speed has gotten really out of control over COVID, and so as if the number of things that has happened since I pitched this research study years ago to today, COVID, I think, has been a huge detriment to this study, because people are just driving at really incredible speeds on the roadway. And we know that speed and pedestrian yielding are really tightly sort of correlated with one another. So the faster you're going, the less likely you are to stop for pedestrian. By the end of the St. Paul study, where we were at, some sites you might be at 85% average yielding for a site. We got some of those sites like really high, drivers were trained up, and I could spot 2 blocks down whether or not a car was going to stop for me just based on the speed alone. They're coming in hot, there's no chance they're stopping. And when my team is out, and Lyndale Avenue and Dowling, some of these roadways are very dangerous for my team to be on. And we see people going 50, 55 miles an hour. Yeah.
Do you have any idea what the average increase in speed is? I'm just curious.
I don't actually. I hope that the cities are doing speed studies on that, but my lab doesn't do speed studies, so I don't know exactly what they are. But yeah, I definitely know when you look at the fatal crashes statewide, it's the percentage of fatal crashes that are speed related are far higher than they've ever been in all the years that I've done this work. But yeah, I don't know exactly what it is, but people are going fast. That's all I can say. The other thing that we're seeing is crossing the center line is just commonplace now. And so they're crossing the center line. They're doing it at an incredibly fast speed, right? Because they know they're doing something that they shouldn't. And so they're going to cross the center line and try to get through it as quickly as they can. So they might be cross the center line, blow through the crosswalk at 50 miles an hour. And so that's really hard for anyone, my team included, to safely get across the roadway. So, our head really has to be on a swivel as we're crossing to make sure that if one vehicle stops for us, we're anticipating when somebody's going to pull out of line to blow past us. So, the average yielding in Minneapolis, we just posted new numbers yesterday, and it's 26%. And that's really been unchanged. So, we started about that in our baseline treatment. We did get a bit of a boost when the crosswalk markings went in at the unsignalized intersections. So one of the other big changes or differences between the two cities is that St. Paul marks a lot of unsignalized crosswalks and Minneapolis does not by policy. So they did agree to mark some of the crosswalks for us as a part of this study. And we did see a boost that did really help because we were getting what we call no hitters. And this never happened in the previous St. Paul study, but we got close in a couple times, and we call a no hitter when you go out. We have to do 20 crossings before we're done with the session. And we'd never had it before where not a single vehicle stopped for us on all 20 crossings. And we were getting that in Minneapolis before the crosswalks were marked. I think we still have gotten that a couple of times and maybe North Minneapolis. But so anyway, incredibly low yielding. And so as the treatments have been rolling in, we're seeing some boost. One sort of success story for a bit was Chicago and 15th. That site really started to make some big improvements. They did some temporary bump outs there and some other sort of traffic calming treatments. And we were getting over 50% occasionally, which was just remarkable because we started at like 18% when we started in that study. But it's still really tough. In contrast, St. Paul has been anywhere from 45 to 55% yielding. So a big jump and difference in yielding rates between the two cities. And we think that that's largely due to better knowledge of the crosswalk law because the police have reinforced the law. I've had people who live in Minneapolis when I'm telling them about the study and how St. Paul is performing better than Minneapolis. One woman said to me, she said, "Oh, that's right, because St. Paul has a law that you have to stop for pedestrians." And I'm like, oh, no, that's a Minnesota law. And she's like, really? I thought that was a St. Paul law. So that's sort of what we're dealing with. Some totally oblivious that it's the state law, and so it's law in Minneapolis. But honestly, ostensibly, it isn't law in Minneapolis because you have close to zero chance of ever getting a ticket for it. And there is a good chance that you will get a ticket for it and St. Paul and in contrast. So unfortunately, I was really hopeful that we would be able to show that you could replicate the study without enforcement. We have not been able to show that. Now, that's not necessarily because it's not true. We might be operating in a really perfect storm of COVID and, slow rollout of some of these engineering treatments. But the takeaway message is I have not been able to replicate the success of the past study without the support of enforcement. Yeah.
I just want to say thank you again for being here, and also like full transparency, I'm the person that wrote the anti-enforcement stance at our streets. So just so like you have that context.
I'm fully aware of our street stance on enforcement.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if as part of the study, if you're having people still stop drivers and like explain what the law is without that being police officers, or because I'm wondering how much of it is like education and how much of it is like the actual ticket.
Mm-hmm. That's a good question. So, we certainly wouldn't be in a position to be able to stop drivers for our team. Now, is there some way that you could do that? Possibly. I think before the decision was made to totally pull enforcement from the study, I had been working with St. Paul PD to try to come up with some alternatives. Could they make the entire study warning only? Could we try to have no ticket involved? Although, being fully cognizant that it is not necessarily the ticket that is the problem when we're talking about the involvement of police and traffic safety. So, certainly always the challenge. I think the hard thing about this study is, it's not for me to decide whether or not we should do enforcement as a part of traffic safety. The question of the research was, can you do it without? Like, can you achieve that success without enforcement? Now, if the question was no or yes, I mean, there's still policy decisions to be made. And it's a little heartbreaking that we weren't able to really answer the question very well based on sort of a string of things that happened. But I will say, my perception of what's different in St. Paul is that people stop because they are worried that we are a plainclothes police officer and they might get a ticket. Like there are multiple sites where it's clear that that's the jam. Like we're on White Bear Avenue. If you've ever tried to cross White Bear, that's like trying to cross a highway. Like you're kind of foolish if you want to do it. And we can get like a pack of drivers to just boom on a dime, they will stop for us because St. Paul PD is out there running their operations. And so it's just, it's really hard to discount the strength of that. Now, again, I think there's other ways to do it. And so, I'm not saying that you can't, you have to do enforcement. It's just sort of, that was the research question. Can we run a similar program that we did last time without enforcement? We've not been able to achieve anywhere near the success that we had last time.
Awesome, thank you. I think we'll do Ken's question and then move on to our next agenda item.
I was just wondering if there was any studies done on maybe identifying and marking certain areas as high pedestrian intersections. If maybe like a different crosswalk pattern or maybe a signage that says you're entering a high pedestrian area, please slow and stuff like that. Do you know of any studies that may have been done on that approach?
I don't. I mean, I know that there are similar types of things where they, use markings that this is a high crash corridor or things like that. I mean, I think ultimately, if it really is a high pedestrian area, then the pedestrians sort of do that. So there is really strength in numbers when you have a lot of pedestrian activity. And so it does help. And we can see some of that difference where some of the sites where drivers are expecting pedestrians. And if you're expecting a pedestrian, it's easier to stop for a pedestrian. And if you aren't, then you don't, you're not looking for them. But I think that's an interesting idea. Somebody could try to flesh out.
We'll go ahead and do Dee's question too. Yeah, so I'll just read that for the sake of the recording. How do results change when transit is present at a studied intersection? So we actually, in the last study, we weren't looking at it in this study, but in the last study, we did look at proximity to transit or a bus stop, and we found that drivers were less likely to stop for a pedestrian if that crosswalk was in close proximity to a bus stop. And so that was a little sad to see. And we ran those results just because we started to suspect it when we were out. So, we sort of started to notice these patterns visually. And so we dug into the data and found that it was true. The reason why we think that happens is a number of the bus stops are near side bus stops rather than far side bus stops. And so what happens with a near side bus stop is that bus platform where pedestrians are waiting for the bus is right next to the crosswalk. And so those bus patrons are hanging out near the crosswalk and create a common distractor where, and this has happened to me time and time again when, I'm like, when I'm driving, of course, I'm looking for any pedestrian that I can stop for because I'm obsessed with the topic. And so I'll stop for somebody. And then I realize like, they're not making eye contact with me and they're really waiting for the bus. They just happen to sort of be standing at the crosswalk entry. And we found even one site in the last study where the Metro Transit was using the bus stop entry as the bus platform. So people waited for the bus in the crosswalk. And then also, but we were kind of like, well, but we like really get ourselves in the roadway. Like we're not hanging by the bus sign, like we're stepped into the roadway, like looking down. But then one time we were out on White Bear and there was a woman waiting for the bus. And what was she doing? Well, she was stepping into the roadway
and looking down the road because she's anxious. Where is the bus and when is it going to get here? So not great. There is also some data to show that there are higher pedestrian crashes near bus stops. That's probably an exposure issue of just you have more pedestrians near, but we also think it could be partly because drivers tend to ignore pedestrians near transit because they assume they're waiting for the bus and they're not as mindful potentially. So number of factors there, but that's what we have found.
Those are really interesting questions and answers. Thank you again, Nicole, for coming. I have so much respect for your work and like how transparent and methodical you are about everything. And I'm really grateful that we have you here doing this work in the Twin Cities. I just think we're so lucky to have you, and thank you for coming to the event tonight and talking to us and for letting us record. Really, really
you bet. I'm happy to share any, I can send you a few publications of some of this past work if anybody wants to reference the old reports and publications, and more than happy to continue to share as we learn more. And we'll be wrapping data collection at the end of October.
Yeah, that would be great. We have some folks on the call who are real like data people. So that would be awesome if you'd be willing to share those with Rachel and she can pass them on.
Yeah. This research is for you all. So I'm always happy to share.
Awesome. Thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and move on to our next thing. Have a good night. Bye.